Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Mátyás Mervay, a PhD candidate in East Asian and Modern European history. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you will enjoy it. The history of foreign communities is often excluded in East Asian national histories. The impact of non-colonial Western expatriates is barely known outside of a small group of researchers who combine their expertise with that of an Asianist. The history of the Shanghai Jewish refugee relief offers a good entry point for those wanting to learn about the Sino-foreign encounter in a non-conventional way. Refugees, migrants, nationals of equal or non-treaty nations, those without the privileges of extraterritoriality, offer a different lens to look at the last days of colonial East Asia. I assume most of you have heard the incredible survival of almost 20,000 Jewish refugees in Shanghai during World War II. Scholars consider the attitudes of Chinese authorities, sovereign and collaborationist, the policies of occupying Japanese administration. Memoirs offered personal accounts from the survivors themselves. Scholarly literature aimed to map the events between 1938 and 1945. Some Chinese scholars take patriotic pride in emphasizing China's uniquely taking in refugees of Nazi persecution, while others point to the colonial conditions and the lack of Chinese sovereignty that allowed for such a no man's land to exist. To be sure, Shanghai was the only safe haven for thousands of mostly German-speaking and other Jews who were turned down by virtually every major power that fashioned itself as anti-fascist. However, the fact that the roots of the Shanghai Jewish refugee relief are inextricably embedded in post-Habsburg Central European diaspora relief efforts is virtually unknown. As a result, one cannot fully account for the survival of the thousands of European refugees who found asylum in China. Men and women of Austrian, Czechoslovak, and Hungarian nationality with single or often multiple ethnic affiliations used to be all over the Shanghai philanthropic scene. Formerly all subjects of the Habsburgs' multi-ethnic empire, their social networks and linguistic abilities reflected centuries of cohabitation in the then already dissolved Austro-Hungarian Empire. No one foresaw that their interwoven post-Habsburg diasporas will become the cradle for the late 1930s local relief efforts. There were various committees in Shanghai assisting Jewish refugees during and after World War II. Post-Habsburg Central Europeans played an important role in almost all of them. The famous International Committee that assisted thousands of refugees with legal documents, finding jobs, raising money for milk for children, etc., was founded by, quote, Hungarians, Czechs, and Austrians of every religion, wrote one of the towering figures of the local community in 1940. Its, quote, heart and soul was the esteemed Shanghailander and Hungarian businessman Paul Komor. Hence its name was known by refugees as the Komor Committee, and its IDs used for the undocumented called Komor passes. What I'd like to show in my presentation today is the significance of post-Habsburg Central Europeans in Republican-era Shanghai as they came to constitute one of the important participants of the Jewish refugee relief of 1938-1945. I will focus on the Hungarian Communities Relief Fund, a direct precursor of Paul Komor's International Committee. It was the late 19th century colonialist scramble that brought Central Europeans from the Habsburg Empire in China. Many of the above-mentioned committee founders settled down at the turn of the century to become, quote, old China hands by the 1930s. Between 1915 and 1922, more than 1,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war found temporary refuge in Chinese territories. Interned in Manchuria, Xinjiang, or Beijing, these men constituted the young republic's first humanitarian challenge and an opportunity to show its competence for the international community. In the 1920s, 1930s, Hungarians were the largest foreign expatriate community without direct consular representation, except for Chinese registered stateless Russians. The majority of more than 500,000 Hungarians concentrated in Shanghai and Harbin. The men, former soldiers of the Great War, their white Russian wives, and their children born on the way down from the Siberian north were in desperate need for jobs, clothes, accommodation. Needy foreigners on both Chinese and colonial territories were normally taken care of by their respective consulates. While Austria and Czechoslovakia sorted out diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, the legal representation of Hungarians wasn't adequately settled until 1949. Such uncertainties taught the community to fend for itself. The engine of Hungarian community organization was a veteran Shanghailander whose family already had experience in relief assistance. Paul Komor, a businessman, was a scion of an assimilated Jewish family. His father, Isidor, left the Habsburg Empire in the late 1800s to run a successful curio enterprise in East Asia. In many ways, the Komors were like the Habsburg version of the famous Baghdadi merchant dynasty of the Sassoons. Father and son, both respected members of the international settlement, had a long history in philanthropy going back to the Russo-Japanese War and World War I. They sent remittances to the captives and hosted escapee POWs before putting them on ships bound for Europe. In the 1920s, Komor engaged in assisting his compatriots via the Dutch Consulate General, a neutral country. The Netherlands took charge of representing Hungarian interests until its occupation by Nazi Germany in 1940. By doing much of the footwork, including regularly corresponding with and being consulted by Budapest about anything concerning Hungarians in China, by the mid-1920s, Komor became the informal leader of the Shanghai Hungarians. Although his 1924 consular appointment was never confirmed by Nanjing, which insisted to first negotiate an equal treaty, Komor's tireless efforts for the community made Jewish refugees even 2 decades later know him as the Hungarian consul. To take care of the destitute in 1924, Paul Komor founded the Hungarian Relief Fund. During its 16 years of operation, the HRF engaged in charity activities within Shanghai and across China. In 1932, when the Great Harbin Flood devastated poor refugee ex-POW communities, the HRF sent remittance to the compatriots in the far north. As trustee, Komor worked relentlessly to secure employment, housing, identification documents, loans, repatriation, and general interest representation for the members of his community. HRF subscriber physicians provided free medical care and operation for patients. Fundraising was done by Komor and his wife, both of whom had an extensive social network in Republican Shanghai. While Mr. Komor lobbied at major clubs and corporations, Mrs. Komor organized charity parties. Donors included individual and corporate, inside and outside of the Hungarian community. Individual benefactors held various middle-class professions. Ethnic Hungarians, often carrying other countries' passports, made up the majority, about 60%. Chinese donations, you see them with brown on this chart, and other non-Hungarian ones were received too. The larger group of individual Hungarians, 37% with the green color in the chart, were business people and company managers. The largest individual donor was the trustee himself, Paul Komor. He was followed by bankers and general managers of international corporations. A smaller group of Hungarians were ex-POWs, about 15% with the blue color, themselves often previous recipients of financial aid. Physicians such as Sir Victor Sassoon's personal doctor, Alexander Renner, and architects like the designer of iconic Shanghai buildings such as the Park Hotel, Laszlo or Ladislav Hudec, made up this cluster of contributions, 5% each. To refer to post-Habsburg interwovenness, I note that Dr. Renner's wife, Theresia Moll, was the chairman of the Danubian Women's Association, while Mr. Hudec held both Hungarian and Czechoslovak citizenship. Hudec and Moll both were natives of today's Slovakia. Corporate charity donations from foreign Shanghai, you see them with the orange color, about 30%, followed individual ones. The main contributors whose support Komor was able to win for the HRF were symbols and pillar institutes of foreign presence, such as the Shanghai Race Club and the French Concessions Charity Fund. Donations by Hungarian-owned corporations such as the Molnár and Greiner amounted to 8% of the total. MNG was itself 7%, was an important Austro-Hungarian enterprise in Shanghai whose employees often engaged in charitable activities, including its manager hosting refugee POWs during World War I. Manager Ernst Kellen, himself an HRF founding member, was a regular subscriber before becoming an Austrian citizen and honorary consul of Austria in Shanghai. During the Jewish refugee crisis, Kellen also served on Comoros International Committee. MNG's Chinese compradors donated to HRF, but only a certain T.E. Wu or Wu Tingmei's name is known. It is plausible to assume that almost all the 3% came from Mr. Wu. Records of the Taiwan-based Academia Historica, Guoshiguan, indicate that MNG also had business dealings, an order of 15 tons of newsprint paper in 1947 with the nationalist government. Based on the available and incomplete data, we can make some meaningful observations about the HRF's finances. Following a steady rise, its best year was 1933, after which the economic repercussions of the Sino-Japanese War left their marks. As the single largest donor, the British Race Club gradually reduced its support. The share of individual contributions kept rising. After 1930, individual donations collectively gave more than the half of the total revenue. In the last years of the HRF, some individual donations even approximated that of the race clubs. In a wartime economic recession, many, even the founders, had to tighten their belt. Even more so, the news of anti-Jewish legislation in Hungary turned away some of the HRF's loyal contributors. They questioned the point to give to a society that bars them from equal rights. In 1940, Hungary's joining the Axis alliance ended the Hungarian Relief Fund. With newly established consulates in the Chinese and Manchu puppet states, the legal representation of Hungarian nationals was finally settled. Conversely, the citizenship of the Shanghai Hungarian community's doyen was questioned. Anti-Semitic tendencies and his bitter disappointment in an ingrate country contributed to Comoros' decision to step down from his role. His relief fund was transformed into a Hungarian association by the new consul architect Hudec that promised stronger integration of the community beyond charity fundraising and occasional cultural events. While one can argue that Comoros' de facto ousting was disgraceful to a man that had been selflessly volunteering for his countrymen, it also unexpectedly benefited a larger multitude of people. After 1940, Komor steered all his energy to the Jewish refugee relief efforts. His name was immortalized, thus, as the trustee of the International Komor Committee. In my talk today, I showed just an example of how a little-known group of people had an impact on events of global importance. The history of post-Habsburg Central Europeans in China talks to various scholarly fields, including refugee and diaspora studies, history of humanitarianism, the Sino-foreign encounter, and modern East Asian history in general. I strongly believe transnationally minded inquiries in East Central European and Chinese connections have a lot to offer for Asian studies. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.